from the Toronto Star. I'm Rudgy Midler, and this matters. Hello, Toronto, and welcome to the Gray Zone. With spring-like weather after a long lockdown, it only makes sense we are all itching to get outside and enjoy it, prompting many to wonder just how long this reopening will actually last. There are two X factors right now, the variants of concern and, of course, the vaccine rollout, which is another set of numbers that we have to take into account. So where are we at? Ed Tubb is a Star assignment editor focused on crime, justice, and COVID-19 data. It's that last one as to why Ed joins us once again on the show. He's been keeping track of a vast amount of COVID-19 information and joins us once again to run the numbers. Ed, thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Happy to be here.
Before we really get into the nitty-gritty, let's just start exactly with what you've been doing, your methodology, and what numbers you've been following.
Well, for actually a year now, it's now getting close to a year, I've been following all of the numbers posted by Ontario's local health units. So these are the 34 local health units in the province that all track local data for their own communities. So in Toronto, that's Toronto Public Health. And these local health units all post daily updates on their COVID-19 case data and their trends. And they've been doing it throughout the pandemic. And I've been following those as close as anyone. What I've been doing since last March, about a year ago, is I've been putting together kind of like a daily count of the case numbers that these local health units put together. So that's allowed me to keep track of what's happening locally across the province. And that sort of helps me understand what's going on with COVID in the province as I'm looking at the start of, say, wave 2 back last fall. You can kind of see where things are happening locally by checking out these local health units. And now that we've gone through wave 2, and then wave 2 has come down from that really, really bad peak we had in January, fallen quite sharply, and we've sort of bottomed out, it seems, and flattened out, and we're looking at possibly a new rise in cases. I am seeing that happen locally. That's what I've been doing, and it's now actually, I need to check and see if it has been a full year, but it's very close to a full year since I've been doing this every day.
Okay, I think that we really need to start with what you just mentioned about things rising. The fact right now we have a Toronto and Peel are reopening, hitting the gray zone. Yesterday, that number touched 1,600 for the first time in a long while, just as we are doing this reopening stuff. What did you think about that?
If you were just looking at the case numbers, you wouldn't be so alarmed by what's happening. What we're looking at is not just the regular COVID-19 that we've had through wave 1 and wave 2. The thing that has experts, and we're talking about like the serious epidemiologists and scientists on Ontario's advisory science table, those people, they are most concerned about these things called variants of concern. And what they are is they are versions of the COVID-19 virus that have mutated throughout the pandemic. And there's 3 of them, and they've all kind of mutated in ways that make them slightly more concerning for one way or another. They're perhaps more infectious, or perhaps they might slightly defeat the vaccines in ways that might be significant, or perhaps they cause more severe illness. So these variants, there's 3 of them. There's one from the UK, one from South Africa, and one from Brazil. They are growing in Ontario right now. We know that right now it's around 30 to 35, maybe even 40% of cases in some local health units in Ontario are these variant cases. The variant that is the most common in Ontario, it seems, is the UK variant. It's called B117. They all have these numerical names. And from studies in the UK, we know that that version of COVID is 40% or more transmissible than the old version of COVID that we've had so far in the pandemic. And what that means is that everything you've done to slow and flatten the curve with the regular COVID may not actually flatten the curve with this B117. What it might do is still leave it in a place where it's growing exponentially and very rapidly. And in fact, what we're seeing in Ontario is exactly that. I think it's best to think of it as sort of 2 parallel pandemics going on at the same time. You've got the old COVID continuing to fall, and it's still continuing to fall rapidly from that peak we had in January when it was worse than wave 1 and thousands of people died. that old COVID is still falling rapidly in Ontario. So even though our cases are kind of bottomed out, they're flattened out, they're not falling anymore, the old COVID is going down still. But underneath that, you've got a very, very sharp rising trend from these variants of concern, probably B117. And what that means is, at some point in the near future, the modeling is projecting that these variants are going to become the dominant strain. And then instead of falling, you're going to instead see the rapid exponential growth that these strains are showing, these variants are showing, take over. And then what we're going to see, according to the province's best scientists, is that we're going to see these case trends start to rise again quite rapidly. And the reason we're most concerned about that is because the latest round of modeling from February 25th, so not that long ago, was projecting that in a worst case scenario, these case numbers would start to rise pretty much this week. And what we've seen so far from the overall case trends in Ontario is that what has been reported since that modeling presentation has been in line with that worst case scenario. So that is why we're scared about these variants, is because we're looking ahead at projections that show this stuff getting back into what you would call a wave 3. Now, there's lots of reasons why this wave 3 won't be as bad as wave 2, but there's still a very good possibility that we're looking at a resurgence of COVID over the next month or so.
I know one of the things that you like to say is don't look at the single day average, look at the 7-day average. What's happening there right now?
Well, the reason I say don't look at a single day number is because it could be up or down for any number of reasons that have nothing to do with the actual trend. There are weekly cycles to how these numbers are produced. You know, more people get tested on a Friday than get tested on a Saturday or a Sunday. So that means that the numbers that show up after that weekend tend to be pretty low. There are often like data glitches or things like that. And those things normally aren't something you really need to worry about because they even out. You know, at the end of the day, a data glitch that happens on Saturday but gets reported on Monday might increase Monday's number, but it doesn't change the average, right? If you smooth out the average over 7 days, you get a much more accurate picture of what's going on. And what we've seen is that the 7-day average has been relatively flat over the last 3 weeks, and it's started to turn up a little bit over the last few days. And that's consistent with what we're expecting. The projections from the science table show that this 7-day average of cases should kind of start to turn up this week-ish. We'll see, but that's consistent with what's happening for now.
We'll be right back. You've already talked a fair bit about the variants, aka the scariants. One of the things I was reading about is that the data with them is also different because to find out what it is, it takes a little bit longer to get that information. Is that fair? It takes about 3 weeks till we find out that information. Like, what's the delay there, and how do we track this?
Why don't I just quickly go through what the variants are, right? So there's 3 of them. I've briefly touched on what B117 is. This is the variant that took over in the UK over the holiday period. It caused a really severe spike in cases in Britain, a very, very high spike in deaths. And then scientists did a bunch of studies on B117, and they decided that it seems like it's much more transmissible, about 40% more transmissible. And more recent data, more recent research is also suggesting that this variant may also be more severe, like it may cause more severe illness. That's the one variant that is here right now in Ontario. We know it's here. That's the one that's probably the most prevalent. There's a South African variant, which is similarly, it seems to be more transmissible. And the risk with the South African one is that it may make vaccination slightly less effective in some cases. That's what some studies say. And then there's a Brazilian variant, which some scientists may think is actually the worst of the bunch. And the reason they think that is because in Brazil, it appears to be reinfecting people who've gone through COVID in the past. So if it defeats sort of this natural immunity, it may be especially scary. All 3 of them are in Ontario. And it seems like B117, the UK variant, is the most common. Now, the issue is that in order to tell apart these 3 variants, you have to take each patient's sample and send it through something called whole genome sequencing, which is a really complicated test that takes a while. And right now, Ontario's data on this whole genome sequencing is about 3 weeks delayed. You can look at the chart of their data on this, and it shows a spike in mid-February, and then it kind of drops off. And that means we don't know anything about which specific variant is growing in Ontario since that time. That said, that's only the last step of testing. Before that, there's a screening test that tells Ontario whether or not a case is one of these three variants of concerns. And that test is quite accurate. And that test is also quite current. The large majority of cases that are being tested in Ontario right now are going through that test. So we have a pretty good idea of how many variants there are in Ontario right now. And that's where we learn that around 35, a little bit more than that, maybe as much as 40% in some local communities are these variant cases. Like 40% of confirmed cases are these variant cases. So that's where we know that the growth is happening. The delay is in trying to understand which of these specific variants is driving this case growth. We think it's B117, the UK variant. We don't know that over the last 3 weeks.
You've already talked about how everything is in line with projections, and I think everyone is really interested in vaccines. It seems to me it's a race now between these variants and the vaccine rollout. What does the data tell us about that right now?
Yeah, normally you might think that you shouldn't hype something up by referring to it as like a race, but in this case, I think that's pretty fair. Vaccines are, right now, the news for vaccines in Ontario is pretty unambiguously good. For the first couple of months of this year, we were having really severe supply problems. So even if we wanted to and had the capacity to vaccinate as many people as we could, we only had so many doses to put into arms that we were struggling to do that. Now, those supply issues are largely resolved. There are now 4 vaccines approved for use in Ontario. Dosing is increasing quite rapidly. Last week, it hit up to 40,000 doses a day on Friday, which is a lot. It's not as much as we need, but it's very good and it's progress, unambiguously positive progress. The thing about vaccinations is that looking ahead, it is absolutely true that vaccinations are the thing that's going to help end this pandemic in Ontario. And it's now, for the first time in a long time, we have a very good idea of a finish line in the future. But we do have to be realistic about that timeline. 40,000 doses a day is a lot, but that number probably needs to be more like 100,000 doses a day. And maybe we'll get there soon. We probably will get there soon. But if we get to 100,000 doses a day, it's still something that's going to take months before we're looking at most of Ontarians vaccinated. We're talking about a timeline for vaccination that only leaves phase 1 at the end of this month. And it's only in April that we start to talk about seniors, or like 60 to 75-year-old seniors getting this vaccine. And these people are still very vulnerable to the virus. And it's only after that, we're talking about in the summer, where we get to general vaccination of younger or adult people without health conditions getting the vaccine. So this is not going away soon. So we really need to be realistic about when vaccination may start to cause a decline in these infection numbers. It's not going to be right away. It's probably not going to be until sometime in April, maybe the end of April, maybe early May, is when we're looking at large numbers of Ontarians being vaccinated. And it's only once you get to those large numbers that you can probably expect to see a significant effect on these case counts. It will eventually happen. But in that meantime is the time where it's very possible that these variants might start to take over. And that's where the risk is. The risk is that the vaccinations may not happen soon enough to prevent a third dangerous wave.
You know, Ed, what are the other numbers? I mean, there's a bunch out there. I know you're recently involved with our LTC project that found some really interesting things. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Maybe there's a slight bit of good news there? Yes, please?
Yes. I mean, there is a lot of good news right now. One of the best pieces of good news to come out of Ontario lately is the fact that the long-term care home outbreaks, touch wood, are probably over. We have vaccinated long-term care home residents. Long-term care homes, our nursing homes in Ontario, have been responsible for the majority of deaths in Ontario's 2 waves. But vaccination in those long-term care homes is largely done. That means that for the most part, we can be fairly confident that outbreaks aren't going to come back and rip through our long-term care homes again and lead to thousands of more deaths. So that means that if there is a wave 3, if these modeling predictions are right, it probably won't be as deadly as wave 2, even if it's much more severe, because in the past, COVID has killed people who are seniors living in nursing homes far more often than anybody else. So the fact that these long-term care homes are vaccinated is going to save many, many, many lives. And in fact, recently over the weekend, we saw research done by Ontario scientists on how many lives were saved by the vaccination efforts that were done through January and February. And it was very significant. So that is good news. Vaccinations work, and we have evidence of that. And we have evidence of that in long-term care homes. And because of that, we're reporting very few deaths in long-term care homes over the last few days. And it seems like that's probably going to continue. And there's no reason to think that any of these variants, even if they spike in the general population, are going to cause these long-term care home deadly outbreaks again, which is a good thing.
And the thing is, right now, we're taking a look at these numbers. It's the gray zone. I can't tell you how many of my friends are like, yo, when are we hanging out? Talking to you, these signs don't look particularly good right now. One, what should people be thinking about that, and how careful should we be right now?
It's spring. I understand it. I'm stir crazy too, like everyone else. You look outside, you see the sun is out longer, the days are nicer, you kind of dreaming of patio weather, all that other stuff. It will end. It's going to end. The vaccinations are coming quickly. It's entirely plausible that vaccination will happen faster than the timelines being put out by Ontario. They've had great success in downloading some of the responsibility for vaccinations to the local health units. The local health units know what they're doing, and they are getting those vaccinations into people's arms quite quickly. So it's very plausible that all of this unfolds slightly more quickly. And there is an end in sight, but until then, it's not over. And in fact, the risks that you may have taken in wave 2 or the summer last year with these variants, they may be more risky until you're vaccinated. It's not over. And these variants may, based on the research we've seen out of the UK, may be more scary for you personally than the previous version of COVID. We're seeing studies that suggest that B117 produces more severe illness. So for me, a 30-something relatively healthy male, that is something that gives me pause if I think about going out into the community to a grocery store, right? Those are things that you should take into account and consider. It's going to end, but it's not yet. And we need to be realistic that the timeline isn't in a couple of weeks. The timeline is in a few months, maybe. And we really got to be still pretty vigilant about these things, because these variants do have potential to cause a wave 3 that could get serious. We can't discount that risk. And we need to be watching what Ontario scientists are telling us in these modeling presentations, because I want to know, is the projection still that wave 3 is expected to take off soon? And if it is, I'm going to be using that to sort of figure out my own personal risk and also what I think might be happening in Ontario. And, in the past, these models have been pretty accurate, and I think it's worth paying attention to what they say.
Well, Ed, we are paying attention to you. We really want to thank you for your time today.
Appreciate it.
Ed Tubb is an assignment editor at the Toronto Star who's been focused on COVID-19 data. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Rajan Budler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisas. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.